Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the EU is offering Tunisia nearly $1 billion in financial aid. The fund could shore up the nation's battered economy and reduce migrant flows. But what are the conditions to receiving it? Also this week, the UK says it's reached a first-of-its-kind economic partnership with the US. The pact fell short of a free trade deal. So, is it a special agreement for a special relationship? And China's youth joblessness in urban cities is at a record high. We find out if moving to the countryside can help solve the problem. Tunisia is cash-strapped and the economy is heading towards a collapse. Basic commodities have been in short supply for months, and many Tunisians are struggling with the rising cost of living. The European Union is worried if the country's economic crisis gets worse, more migrants could cross the Mediterranean Sea to seek a better life in Europe. So it's offered the nation financial help. But what is the bloc asking for in return? Mohammed Val reports.
For the second time in just a week, the President of the European Commission, along with the Italian and Dutch Prime Ministers, have come to Tunisia for talks with President Kais Saied. Their main focus is migration, smuggling and economic cooperation.
The European Commission is considering macro-financial assistance as soon as the necessary agreement is found. And we are ready to mobilise up to €900 million for this purpose of macro-financial assistance. As an immediate step, we could provide an additional up to €150 million in budget support right now.
Tunisian economy is in crisis and the nation's credit rating has been recently downgraded by agencies with fears of the country defaulting on its debt. The rescue plan has to be endorsed by EU governments and Tunisia has to finalise another deal with IMF. The said deal involved a $1.9 billion loan for Tunisia, but Tunisian President Kais Saied rejected the painful reforms required in the terms of the offer.
I mean, when you look at the different conditions from the IMF, it does include subsidies, especially into products of first necessities that the poorest of Tunisians need. Having those conditions linked to an IMF loan is something that Kais Saied doesn't really want to have, but at the same time doesn't really have a choice.
Analysts believe the EU's ultimate objective behind the rescue plan is to ensure Tunisia's full cooperation on the issue of migration. Tunisian president has been critical of EU policies.
They are victims of a global system that unfortunately treats them not as human beings, but as numbers. We cannot play the role that some play openly and others hide, being guards for their countries. The solution can only be humane, collective, and based on the law.
Tunisia has recently turned into a favourite transit point for migrants trying to cross to Europe by sea. The EU fears a potential deterioration of the economic situation in Tunisia could make it more difficult to control migration flows. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us from London is Thomas Gwiatkowski. He's the Senior Practice Director, Global Counsel, and the head of the Global Counsel MENA office here in Doha. Thank you for your time, sir. So tell us a bit more about this European proposal for Tunisia. What exactly does it entail and how much difference will it make to Tunisia's economy?
The deal, I think, is quite an important step within a lengthy process of getting Tunisia to an IMF deal. And so what it contains exactly, it's an offer to Tunisia to join an IMF program that has been under discussions now for over half a year. So the deal contains financial assistance, some of that immediate, some of that, or the largest amount, around 900 million in macro financial assistance, which would help the Tunisian government and central bank to stabilize its external finances. The deal also includes an offer to upgrade the existing trade agreement with Tunisia. It contains provisions on energy, on people-to-people contacts, and also, and that's, I think, very important from a European perspective as well, it contains enhanced cooperation on migration, where we have recently seen large numbers embarking from Tunisia to Italy and Malta.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me more about that. How much of this money is being directed towards dealing with the migration crisis?
So that will actually be a small part. So out of the 1.15 billion, this is only 100 million that will go to the border enhanced border protection. So it's a fairly small amount. But if you look at similar deals that the EU has struck with Egypt, with Libya, and others, it's not insignificant. Of course, from an EU perspective, the migration question is much more than about the border issues, but also about how can you actually stabilize the Tunisian economy in order to reduce, if you will, the push factors that are making Tunisians leave the country.
No, indeed, that does make sense. But EU leaders have said that pumping money into Tunisia will actually kill the business model of smugglers. Do you think that is a realistic option?
So I don't think it's an option, at least in the short term. I think, if you think about enhanced border protection, what it does, it makes obviously the smuggling business riskier, makes it costlier, without addressing, at least in the short term, the underlying factors that drive people to leave Tunisia. So I think in the short term, it's probably not achieving that to a large extent, even though it securitizes perhaps the issue. In the longer term, it's clear to everyone that Tunisia needs a solid economic strategy. It needs a solid financial support, not only from the EU, but from the IMF and other multilateral and bilateral donors. So in a sense, getting Tunisia to a wider package will help its various challenges in the longer term. But in the short term, I think that will be rather challenging.
What do you make of the EU's motive here? Because President Kais Saied seems very skeptical of this deal.
So I think there is perhaps to some extent this feeling that European leaders, certainly worry about migration, basically want to get Tunisia on board to now restrict, the amount of people and boats leaving Tunisian shores and so on. And there has been Tunisia, like also Algeria and others, have been more resistant to working with the EU on the migration issue. But of course, like so many leaders in the Mediterranean, he also knows that because it's such an issue for Europe, it also gives him leverage over Europe. And you could also argue that the offer that Europe is making to Tunisia is to some extent obviously an expression of that, namely that Europe really needs an economically stable Tunisia in order to have a sustainable solution on the migration question.
What about the IMF funds that Tunisia is hoping to receive? Again, President Kais Saied has been very critical of some of the reforms being asked of Tunisia. What do you make of them?
The problem with IMF reforms is that they always offer short-term pain for long-term gain. And President Saied has at least, is supposed to call or hold presidential elections next year, which actually makes this period now until the elections, at least should they take place, quite an important time period. And of course, reforms are potentially painful. Reforming SOEs, cutting energy subsidies, tackling the public sector wage bill, among many other things, will create unease in certain parts of Tunisia. And so the question is very much whether a deal can be agreed with the IMF, because I think something needs to get done in order to avoid a default of Tunisia. But the question is perhaps to what extent the Tunisian authorities and the IMF can agree on a deal that makes it politically feasible for the current administration, that has more flexibility perhaps than past agreements in terms of the reforms that are required as part of the agreement, and especially also the time frame that is required to implement those reforms.
Really good to get your perspective. Thomas Grotowski, a Senior Practice Director, Global Counsel, speaking to us there from London. Thank you.
Thank you.
Britain has sought a comprehensive trade agreement with the US since its withdrawal from the European Union more than 3 years ago. But the free trade deal promised in the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto appears to be on hold. The Prime Minister believes the world has evolved since then. He's delivered an economic agreement with Washington, which he says tackles the challenges and opportunities faced now and in the future. Rishi Sunak and President Joe Biden have announced a limited trade pact dubbed the Atlantic Declaration. It covers critical minerals, defence cooperation, supply chains, data protection and sensitive technologies. According to the White House, the agreement is aimed at reducing strategic dependencies on rival powers. Well, the British Prime Minister made it clear that the two nations are strengthening economic security in response to growing threats from China and Russia.
Countries like China and Russia are willing to manipulate and exploit our openness, steal our intellectual property, use technology for authoritarian ends, or withdraw crucial resources like energy. They will not succeed. Today we have agreed the Atlantic Declaration, a new economic partnership for a new age, of a kind that has never been agreed before.
So what exactly is this Atlantic Declaration? Well, it's expected to give British firms access to tax credits under the US Inflation Reduction Act. The $370 billion subsidies program was introduced by President Biden to boost green investment in the US. As part of the declaration, the UK will also be designated a domestic source for defence contractors. That allows bigger American investment in British companies. It also includes a commitment to a data bridge, which would allow UK firms to transfer data freely to American organisations without any red tape. The two nations will also cooperate on artificial intelligence, civil nuclear power and sensitive technologies, among other areas. Joining us now from Barcelona is Vicky Price. She's the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Thank you for joining the programme, Vicky. This is not quite the US-UK trade deal that was promised by the Tories. Can you explain exactly how this will benefit the UK economically?
Well, it's interesting when you look at the aspects of the deal, because they include being able to move goods more easily, particularly on the defence side, where, of course, there is a serious concern right now internationally. So you have that agreement that in terms of exchanging goods and also the UK being able to supply the US with whatever inputs it's required for the defence cooperation that already exists, of course, between the US, the UK and Australia, which has been struck, of course, quite recently, that is allowing free movement of products. Also, of course, it's in the area of minerals and the types of material that is absolutely needed for moving into the green technology area. So that's quite an important part for the UK to ensure that there are no tariffs, or at least there is easier trade between the two countries. So the cost to businesses in the UK is considerably less, both in terms of being able to export and, of course, being able to import as well. And then very significantly is the question of whether some of the inputs from the UK into, let's say, the production of cars can be considered to be a domestic input, because under the new rules that are being set up in the US, you have to have a certain domestic content in production, by which we mean US, if you are allowed to enjoy some of the subsidies that are being offered now for development. So the UK is getting into the position of being able to be considered a domestic one under some rules, but the EU, of course, is trying to do exactly the same. So the UK is not the only one which is worried about these issues.
The Labour Party, as you would expect, have been incredibly critical, saying that it's going to leave Britain's cupboards bare. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, what one needs to worry about is whether the trade deals that are being negotiated, whether you want to call them a free trade deals or any other agreements that there may be, are benefiting more the UK than they're benefiting, or some rather are benefiting more those we're striking deals with rather than the UK. And there have been concerns about regulations, which are considerably laxer in some countries, including, of course, in the US, and considerable concern about agricultural products. Well, this particular agreement doesn't have very much to do with that aspect of it. It's really much more incorporating it in other areas, including, of course, services. And I think that's good news from that point of view. But there is always the concern that the deal with Australia, the possible deal eventually with the US as well, may in fact end up with their agricultural products coming into the UK a lot more easily than is the question for UK farmers exporting anything to the wider world, if you like, and therefore that by just reducing also some of the regulatory requirements, we may end up poorer in the UK than would otherwise be the case. So those trade deals may not help us very much. But I think there is a very important requirement right now to work with the US on all these areas that the US is investing in and being part of this rather than being outside it. And the UK, of course, is in a strange position because having left the EU, it can't negotiate with any particular might because it's just one country trying to get into this. But the defense and other close relationships that the UK has with the US is something that can be built on. I think that is what Rishi Sunak is trying to achieve right now.
And from what you've been saying, it sounds like Britain's access under the US Inflation Reduction Act is going to be a good advantage to them.
Yes, I think that will be helpful. The question is, of course, exactly how it works out, because the implementation is going to be very important. But as I was saying, the EU is trying to do the same. So, of course, there's going to be the issue of competition and who gets there first and which parts of the whole process, perhaps, is the UK going to have a competitive advantage on by comparison to other countries in the EU. But I think in this particular area, you can see how, staying close to the US, which is going to be spending vast sums of money in supporting its own industry with huge subsidies on the green front in particular, is a very vital part in the way in which geopolitics is moving right now.
And just looking to the future, do you think a more substantial trade deal between the US and the UK could come about?
It could, but for the moment, of course, because of the presidential elections, nothing is going to be going on. And we know that President Biden has not put that at the top of his agenda. The question, of course, is who is going to be president in the future? And we do know that President Trump didn't really have any huge interest in achieving anything very much either. And certainly if there is a change of government in the UK, that may prove to be difficult as well in terms of any possible, seeing eye to eye in particular areas. So big question mark, frankly. Whether the US in particular is going to have an interest in doing any deals either with the UK or with the EU, that's going to be something that we just cannot foretell right now.
Vicky, so interesting to talk to you. Thank you for your input. Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research.
Thank you.
China's economic recovery after lifting strict COVID restrictions has had a strong start to the year. But the rebound is now starting to lose steam and youth unemployment is at a record high. More than 20% of the nation's 16 to 24 age group were unemployed in May. That's 1 in 5 young people. And there are indications the situation could get even worse. Victoria Gatenby reports.
Times are tough for these Chinese graduates. They're looking for work at this recruitment fair in Shenyang City in the northwestern province of Shanxi. But competition for full-time jobs is intense. Unemployment among 16 to 24-year-olds has hit a record high in China. More than 1 in 5 are now without work. That's nearly double pre-pandemic levels and 4 times higher than the national unemployment rate. A growing number of young people are moving to rural areas to find work. So far, Anji County in Zhejiang province has persuaded more than 600 urban youths to relocate. Most are doing freelance, remote work.
Do not start your life in a city where you can't even have a life or where you can't even survive. You can go to Tier 2 or Tier 3 cities or even small counties. It's all okay.
The Chinese government is taking steps to promote employment for college graduates. It's announced a 15-point plan including skills training and pledged to create 1 million internship positions in state-owned companies over the next 2 years. But with around 12 million young people set to enter the workforce this year, some worry it's too little, too late.
One thing that if you look at the recent statistics, that the record number of university graduate going after master degree or PhD degree. So, the real challenge might be even after 2 or 3 years are all these graduates coming out from the master program.
To make matters worse, recent data suggests China's post-pandemic economic recovery is beginning to lose momentum. Imports are contracting and industrial output is falling short of expectations. Economists say getting young people back to work is a priority, not least because they account for nearly 20% of the country's consumer spending. Victoria Gatenby for Counting the Cost.
I'm joined now from Hong Kong by Carlos Casanova, a senior economist at Asian Union Bancaire Privée, UBP. Thank you for joining the programme, sir. So why has youth unemployment risen so much in China?
Hi, thanks for having me. So we are seeing a significant increase in youth unemployment, and that is despite the headline unemployment number remaining quite low at 5.2%. From today's data, we've seen it go even higher from a record of 20.4% last month to a new high of 20.8%. Now, there are many reasons for this. Of course, the expectations of the economic recovery are still quite sluggish, and so many specifically private sector companies are postponing their decision to hire. That is not going to change until there is an inflection in sentiment. And of course, the private sector is hugely important in terms of employment because it constitutes 80% of employment, contrary to the belief that the state is the largest employer. And second is the types of jobs that younger people tend to go for, which are predominantly concentrated in the services and also the tech industry. And of course, that's an industry that has been struggling from the regulatory crackdown in the last couple of years.
So what do you make of the government's 15-point plan to tackle this issue?
It's a good starting point. I think these measures are always look very good, but it typically entails a lot of training and coaching. Keep in mind also that much like the housing sector, the labor market is slow to move. So it might still take many quarters before we see that inflection point. And to my point earlier, if you have a sector like the private sector that accounts for 80% of the jobs in China, the most effective way to address the issue is to allow for some deregulation in the private sector, remove some of the cobwebs and provide visibility for the private sector going forward so that the private sector companies have the confidence to hire people and don't continue to postpone their decisions.
It's really interesting. We heard from President Xi Jinping towards the end of last year talking to urban youth and saying you need to move to the countryside to get jobs, which is quite ironic. What is the logic behind that? And do you think it makes sense?
I think there is a group of people that might benefit from some of the trends that we are seeing in terms of reducing some of the regional inequalities. We are seeing a shift, in particular in manufacturing, away from Tier 1 cities into inland parts of the country. We are seeing that a lot, for example, with the iPhone assembly moving from Shenzhen up north. And so for a certain group of predominantly unskilled workers, that might make sense for them to seek opportunities in some of these cities that are going to take over in terms of manufacturing. But of course, when we talk about university graduates, and by the way, we expect youth unemployment is only going to get worse over the summer months as more of these students join the labor force after graduating. For those types of workers, you still need high-skilled opportunities within tech and other private spheres. And currently, we don't think that the policy mix is supportive enough to those sectors to ensure a smooth recovery in youth unemployment in the months ahead.
So what's your forecast then? I mean, looking at the economy, as you say, the data is slowing down. What kind of impact does these sort of youth unemployment figures have on the larger, wider economic picture?
It's preventing the broadening of the economy away from just pure consumption of services post-reopening to a more sustainable consumption trajectory with stronger domestic investment. The reason for that is it's one of the things that is dragging on sentiment. So together with the housing sector, that has been very sluggish to recover, and Chinese households have a lot of exposure to real estate. About 60% of household wealth is linked to real estate. The other factor is the labor market. If you hear stories of your friend's kid who has been unemployed for the past 18 months, or if you are yourself a parent that is supporting your child because your child is unable to find employment, you are very unlikely. You're not going to be willing to deploy some of your pandemic surpluses to consume when you still have this looming uncertainty that is affecting your private life. So we do think that this increase in youth unemployment over the summer months is unfortunately going to make it more difficult for the authorities to pivot and to broaden the economic recovery. And so it is going to be much more challenging to put together a package of measures that simultaneously addresses all these issues.
Carlos, thank you so much for your insight. Carlos Casanova, a senior economist at Asia Union Bancaire Privée UBP, speaking to us there from Hong Kong. Thank you. And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or, of course, you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.